Begin inside the brain. You may not realize this, but in your head, your brain is actually floating in a warm bath of cerebral spinal fluid. And the outside surface of our brain, the cortical surface, is really responsible for mapping and making sense of the world outside. And so if you're in a well-calibrated float tank, not a single photon of light should be entering your brain, which means the entire posterior sector of the brain that's responsible for processing and creating our visual world suddenly doesn't have information coming in. Likewise, the area of the brain responsible for hearing and auditory processing shouldn't hear any outside sounds, except maybe the internal workings of the own body. And so much of what floating is about the body. A large part of our parietal cortex and cerebellum is responsible for creating a sense of our body in space. But when you're floating, there is no space. It's limitless. And likewise, in a well-calibrated float environment, you lose sense of tactile sensation because the temperature is so well-calibrated. The air and the body and the water all match perfectly. And so you lose track of where the body begins and where it ends. Likewise, the areas of the brain responsible for taste and smell also aren't receiving any stimulation. So much of our lives is about movement and speech. The frontal cortex is really about that aspect. And floating is one of the few moments in life where we're not fidgeting, where we're not speaking and moving and incessantly and compulsively engaging in the world. We're just laying still. And so this entire swath of the frontal cortex responsible for planning and executing movements suddenly doesn't have to activate. It goes into a state of quiescence. And let's not forget, the brain is not living in a vacuum. The tail of the brain, the spinal cord, also gets a chance to take a respite. Think about it. Every moment of the day, this poor spinal cord is having to face gravity. And then suddenly, that's gone too. So when I first thought about floating, a little over 6 years ago, as a neuroscientist, I thought, my goodness, what a profound intervention for the nervous system. A nervous system that in modern society is being inundated with stimulation, suddenly finds itself in this most unusual of circumstances. And I thought to myself, boy, all these patients I'm seeing every day with severe anxiety, with severe stress, whose nervous systems are on the fray, hypervigilant, hyper-aware all the time. What would happen in this environment? What would that do for their nervous system? And so, 2013, my first float conference, I had an incredible meeting with Colin Stanwell Smith, really a prolific engineer in his own right. But he designs float pools, custom designs float pools. And I came to him in that 2013 conference and I said, Colin, make me a float pool that will do all this, but will allow somebody with severe anxiety or post-traumatic stress to actually go into it. And so Colin looked at me, he handed me a card, he shook my hand and he said, let's do it. And that's exactly what he did. This is an open circular pool. The room itself is soundproof, light-proof, temperature-controlled, humidity-controlled. You have complete control over the lights. He created an infrared wave detection system, so if the person wants the light on, they could be floating anywhere and they just wave their arm. And suddenly, when I would bring patients with severe anxiety and stress into my float clinic, patients who were very resistant to this idea, maybe very scared and hesitant, maybe very anxious, they would see this pool and immediately say, oh, I could do that. And it made me realize that this could be a clinical tool, a clinical flotation tool. And Colin and I have been talking about this now for the better part of 5 years. And Floataway itself is now actually moving towards a clinical model where they're going to be designing open float rooms for hospitals, for medical care settings, so patients can now access something that they were scared to do prior. So with this in hand, we decided to put it to a test. Let's see if this actually helps the patients, if it helps their nervous system recalibrate,